Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shakespeare & Company. It's great to see so many of you turn out on this rather sultry Parisian evening. Just to let you know, we have checked about a dozen different weather apps, and I think we're going to be okay for the next hour. But on the off chance the skies do cloud over and open, I think it'll probably be quite refreshing nonetheless. But anyway, cross your fingers and pray for sun for the next hour or so. Sour Heart, Jenny Zhang's debut short story collection, introduces readers to half a dozen girls, children, teenagers, and young adults, each the daughters of Chinese immigrants to the United States, each subtly and distinctively drawn, each discovering what it's like to grow up between two cultures, two languages, and two histories. The stories in Sour Heart are raw and rich, balancing an exquisite tenderness and empathy for their protagonists with perfectly lobbed grenades of humour, often wildly scatological in tone. The book's heart may be sour, but it's also well and truly in the right place. Sour Heart is also a masterclass in linguistic gymnastics, gauging perfectly when sentences should be reined in and when they can be cut loose. This, coupled with a vibrant and idiosyncratic vocabulary, conspire to make Jenny Zhang a unique and unmistakable new voice in American letters. Now, if you visit Jenny Zhang's website, you'll see that the New Yorker called Sour Heart frequently disgusting. But in her modesty, Jenny Zhang doesn't tell us that it also called the collection beautiful and moving, or that The Guardian called it rich with reinvention, or that The Times instructed us to relegate anything else you're reading, or that Pankaj Mishra selected Sour Heart as one of his books of the year, wrote that it deliciously subverts conventions of, quote, immigrant literature. Sour Heart was named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker, NPR, the Oprah Magazine, The Guardian, Esquire, New York, BuzzFeed, New York Magazine, and Nylon. Jenny Zhang also won the PEN Bingham Prize for Debut Fiction, the LA Times Art Seidenbaum Award for First Fiction, was a finalist for the Believer Book Award and the NYPL Young Lions Fiction Award. Most prestigious of all, however, was an honour that Jenny Zhang achieved about 8 years ago, before any of her books were published, when she blew the minds of the audience in this very bookshop, winning the one and only competitive open mic night we have ever hosted. We're delighted to finally be able to welcome her back to Shakespeare & Company. Please give it up for Jenny Zhang.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It is the highest achievement I've ever achieved. Won an open mic here. And my prize was an old pulp novel from the 60s.
And which one was it? Do you remember?
I don't know. It was very trashy. I did read it. It was great.
I'd like to begin, I guess, with the title of the collection,
yeah,
which draws on the first story, We Love You, Crispina, and it seems to me that sort of this story itself sets the tone for what we're going to expect from Sour Heart. And I think for readers, when you first see the title, there seems something almost contradictory about the term. It seems like an odd turn of phrase. There's almost a kind of cognitive dissonance produced by this idea. I was wondering, could you just talk a little bit about this concept of a sour heart and what it means to the collection?
Yeah. Well, so as you said in the first story of this collection, We Love You, Crispina, the 9-year-old daughter who is narrating the story, albeit retrospectively, she loves like sour things. She loves she's kind of like, she hates sweetness. She loves sourness. And so her parents call her like little nicknames, like instead of sweetheart, they call her sour heart. And I thought, you know, as I was like putting the book together, that it was sort of like, it casts like kind of the right kind of sunlight or something over the entire collection, because I don't know, like, these are people who smile when it's overcast. You know, these are people who believe that there is such a thing as, like, a good kind of pain. And that, you know, there's like, sweetness in sort of the sour, bitter miseries of life or something. And that there is something sickly about a certain kind of sweetness. And so I just felt like it was sort of a good way to encapsulate all of these narrators who are all girls, a lot of them are greatly disliked by others, even though they really like themselves. And I thought that also, the worst thing you can be as a girl is sour. I mean, it's not actually the worst thing, but the worst thing is like deemed by society is to have a sour face, a bitchy, resting face, to be unlikable, to not be sweet. And so I just thought I would like pay homage to that sentiment. And then afterward, which I hadn't thought about, some of my friends reminded me that sour in Chinese is also it means like to ache, or a kind of ache, and it has sort of a more bittersweet feeling to it, and which made sense.
Because when you talk about these people, your 6 narrators, your 6 protagonists in the book, as I said in the introduction, so they're all daughters of immigrant Chinese families, and obviously, I guess sometimes it's dangerous to ask the author to kind of over-explain the significance of certain things. But certainly, as a reader, when I like this idea of the sour heart, it also did seem to encapsulate this slight sort of dislocation that these kind of daughters living between 2 cultures might feel.
Yeah, totally. And this feeling of like you've gone bad, or you've been like spoiled, not in the spoiled rotten kind of way, but like you're, like organic matter that has literally spoiled and rotted. And yeah, it is this feeling of like, like when something sours, you throw it away. It's garbage. It's trash. And so it is a little bit about, I guess it's a little bit more metaphorical, but this sort of figurative way in which a lot of these stories are about women looking back at a time in their puberty and adolescence when they were kind of wondering, like, who's going to love me and my sour heart. Although, that phrase was used in the latest Paul Thomas Anderson movie, so now it looks like I cribbed it from him. That movie, Phantom Thread. Did you see that?
Yeah, no.
There's like a scene where he talks about his sour heart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we've got dates. We know that your book
I own
was
the
out
copyright.
First. This was 2017.
But yes.
I think one of the things that really struck me about the collection also was just how central families are to all of the stories. I mean, the sort of the interaction between the narrators and their families in different ways in each story, but it's so crucial to the way each of the stories play out. And not only that, I think maybe we've come to expect from literature that sort of representations of families will be broadly negative in some ways, as families having quite a destructive effect on the psyche of the narrator. And that's not at all what we get from your book. I mean, these are by no ways perfect families, and they had no way, not 100% positive effects on their daughters. But it really struck me the positivity that most of your narrators express towards this idea of family.
Yeah. I love that you picked up on that, because I think I was also, everybody writes against or in, following a tradition. And I don't know if I'm following or against a very long tradition, but there is a tradition of stories of immigrant stories about immigrating, stories about people who are first and second generation, people who have been displaced and dislocated, and I think often the story that people are used to reading, and perhaps in America almost want to hear, is the story of the second generation kid who hates their first generation parents, who are so crude, who are so clueless, who are so conservative, who are so ignorant, who won't let their children be free. I think that is, I think it's a narrative that very conveniently services the idea that of America being the best place on earth, and who wouldn't want to be an American? Who would want to be stuck in the old world when you could be embracing the freedom of the freedom and bliss of America? And I think I wanted to show stories where even though these girls are mad in some ways at their families, like as they get older, they realize what they're angry about is like the American dream, and specifically like the lie of the American dream, the bullshit of the American dream, the utter abusiveness of the American dream, because it dangles something impossible in front of people who are set up to fail to achieve it and then blame themselves and the people they come from for failing to achieve it. So I wanted to sprinkle that throughout. And on the flip side of that, I wanted to show that, like, actually these children really, like, they're very attached to their families. They're very attached to the kind of, like, way in which, like, when you've been through, like, a battle, whether it's a physical battle, like a real war, or maybe a more emotional, psychological sort of battle, you feel bonded with the people who went through it with you. And there's like a way in which, you know, these are girls who come and immigrate with their families during the 90s to New York City from Shanghai, and they immigrate in a very specific way, and they go through very similar common experiences because they all kind of come around the same time. And it's not that they want to go back to the experience of poverty and hardship and struggle, but there is a way in which the only people who know what that's like are their parents and their siblings and their family members and their extended community.
It's very interesting what you say about the American dream, because one thing I picked up on in all of the stories was this sort of, even though the girls were very young when they emigrated to the States and sort of for the most part, sort of fully assimilated and fully integrated into America, there was always this sense of, if we could talk about the sense of what felt like home to them, was always with their families. I mean, there are moments where one of the narrators says, for example, you know, it's this is a country that likes our food but hates our faces.
Yeah.
And I really picked up on that idea of family and home really being central to the experience. And I find that fascinating, because that's a reaction against the failure of the American dream to really work for these girls, in fact.
Right, because the thing you're not supposed to do when you immigrate to another country is fail to assimilate. It's considered it's considered a failure, and it's considered, I mean, now it's very politicized. Of anyone who has failed to assimilate needs to be literally deported or kicked out. But this expectation that if you move to another country, you should model yourself after the dominant culture in that country. Well, then what happens if you move to another country and that country indicates daily in a non-stop assaultive way that they hate you, that they find you repulsive, disgusting, subhuman? Why would you have any, incentive to blend in when you're being told every day you can't? And so I think these girls, when you're second generation, or in the case of some of the girls in these stories, they move when they're like between the ages of 5 and 7, so they're almost like 3 and 7 years old, so they're almost like 1.5 generation, where in effect, if you were to speak to them on the phone, you wouldn't necessarily know what race they were. If you were to read something they wrote, you wouldn't think like, I know this is a Chinese person, but then when they show their faces, they're alien. And so they're constantly swerving between sort of how they feel inside and how they are regarded on the outside. And I think when you are very in between, whether you're an immigrant or whether you're an expat or an exile, when you're in a place where you can almost blend in but you never can quite feel, but where you don't have roots, where the person before you is somewhere else, like the generation before you is elsewhere. I think when you're in between in that way, home can be a thing that you travel with. Home can be another person. Home is not really like a place. It's not really a structure. It's not really nationhood, but it's a relationship you have with another person. It could be home could be a phone call you make, you know, for 20 minutes. And then it's gone and it's ephemeral. And also on the flip side, that person can make you feel like they're not your home. There are also times in these stories where, because these girls grow up, you know, when you grow up in a country as an ethnic minority versus when you immigrate to that country, you have different experiences. And so there are times when these girls are talking about things that they experienced at school that their parents can't relate to. And so suddenly, like, home is not with their parents. And so it's like a constantly shifting thing. It's like tectonic plates. I'm not a scientist, so this might be completely wrong. But, you know, you can't step on the same exact point and have the same plates, like, underneath you. It's constantly shifting underneath your feet.
And also, I guess, the expectations they grow up with as well. I mean, there's... In one of the stories, one of the narrators, she's off to Stanford, if I remember correctly, and it's sort of it's dealing with this idea of the sort of the life that she feels that she wants, and also the life that in a way she feels she owes her parents to live.
Right.
And it seems to be quite a sort of a common tension in a lot of the stories, actually, sort of like drawn between these two poles and these two sets of influences.
Well, it's this idea that even before you're born, you're not free because someone has paid a debt for you to be born, to exist, to have food, to pursue what you want to pursue, and the enormous burden to feel like your life has been and will always be at the cost of someone else's. That, like you said, for someone to be able to go to Stanford, it means that their parents can't take a vacation for 20 years. Like, it's very hard to then feel good about like doing that, but then at the same time these parents are kind of saying, no, please go to Stanford, we want you to go to a really good school, but if you do that, then that means you will forever live on a plane of existence that the people who made it possible for you to exist on that plane can never arrive at or, you know, get to.
And that's something which plays out obviously in the United States itself, but also in addition to the sort of the contemporary family story, one of the things which recurs in a lot of these stories is this idea of family history as well. And I think particularly for Chinese immigrants of the generation you're writing about, this is it's almost impossible for the children to identify with the suffering, with the hardships of their parents' generation, of their grandparents' generation.
Right.
And this is definitely something which you use in several of the stories as a way to sort of I guess perhaps underscore the distance between the experience of the children and their parents.
Yeah, it's like pain that's inherited but cannot necessarily be understood.
Because like there are parents that were, grandparents that were tortured.
Right.
The parents that lived in fear because of actions taken by the Chinese government, and then it's just a very interesting experience to see like that. It's not like the parents try to make the children feel guilty, but the children seem to have to sort of process this guilt, which they kind of take upon themselves, of almost not having had to live through the same experience. Right,
and it creates sort of a obstruction of understanding on both sides, and like you said, this is, you know, people who have parents who have like, you know, fought in wars or went like experienced like the Great Depression, have I think similar issues where the older generation is talking about a kind of pain that the younger generation literally cannot even imagine. In the case of these girls, their parents are talking about things that happened in a country they've never even been to, some of them. So it's like they're imagining nothing, but they're feeling the effects of the pain. But on the flip side, it's hard for someone who experienced like a literal sort of, you know, tyrannical, like proto-fascist government, you know, famine on the scale of 50 million people dying. It's really hard for that parent to be like, oh, so you're being bullied at school, that's your problem. That's why you're like crying every day. Just get over it. You know, like it's very, very hard for someone. It's hard on both people. And of course, I think because I'm writing from the perspective of these girls, I'm showing like it's not just someone called me ugly. It's that every day this is the form that dehumanization takes for me in my particular time and place right now. But again, it's almost insulting to try and say that to someone who was like, my friend was murdered when I was 12.
But that's it. But I think it's one of the things you do really very well and very subtly in the collection is that sort of push and pull of empathy between the generations. I mean, certainly from the children just sort of coming to understand what their parents and what their grandparents experienced, but also with the way that the parents almost summon the courage to empathize with the seemingly irrelevant problems of their children. And there's definitely this sort of fascinating interplay which I think sort of reading as somebody sort of not from that background, it gives you an insight into how certain stories play out.
Thank you.
I think I'm interested in the fact as well that you chose 6 narrators, because I think often when people would write a collection of short stories with different narrators, the temptation would be to make the experiences of the narrators as distinct as possible, because you don't want people to think they're all autobiographical stories or all like broadly the same character. But at the same time, the girls you're writing about, as you said earlier, they do have, in certain sort of fundamental respects, a broadly similar experience of life. And was it quite a challenge for you sort of developing these kind of distinct voices while also highlighting the sort of commonality of experience between them?
Yeah, it was a challenge. And I think in the future, I think you and I were talking about this before of whatever, I'm learning how to write. If I write another book, hopefully I will learn from the mistakes of this book. And there are ways in which I look back on these stories and I do see the ways in which I had failed to make them as distinct as I possibly could have, and perhaps I'll try to change that in the next book, or perhaps I will just do it again. Who knows?
But I think just to interrupt, I think that's one of the strong points of the book actually, is that you don't force yourself to make them distinctive. You acknowledge that if you're of a certain background at a certain time, then there will be a commonality of experience.
Yeah, right. I did want to show a group portrait. I wanted to show, because these are people who immigrated before Tiananmen, but after China opened up. And that's actually a pretty small cohort of people, like, in the late 80s, before 1989. It's a very distinct cohort of people. You couldn't really immigrate to America from China unless you were going as a foreign exchange student, for example. You couldn't just like come from mainland China if you, were like a rural worker. There were very few ways for that to happen, and there were many more ways for a certain type of person to come. And I do think that just in the ways of like, not all women are the exact carbon copies of each other, but like the nature of womanhood, because of like various experiences of patriarchy, has made it so that I think a lot of women can sympathize and understand a certain experience. The same thing with whatever kind of minority. Like, it's not that, every minority of a certain ethnicity or race or of a certain class background has the exact same tendencies and personalities, but they will have a sort of like, there will be a shared commonality often. And so I did want to show the ways in which they do resemble each other, because they all experience such a similar and specific experience, but they all are like quite different in very specific ways. Maybe not specific enough, but
I wonder if one of the kind of elements of commonality of experience as well is in the interaction with the language as well. And that's definitely something, I made reference to it in the introduction. Like, one of the things that really sets your writing apart, I think, from a lot of contemporary fiction is the richness of the vocabulary and the way that you play with the language, the way that you bend it, and you seem to be having a lot of fun with the language. But also language is something which comes up as a topic in a lot of these stories, because of course these girls are they're learning the language, but they're also being judged for their language abilities, even if they are actually sort of higher than, people assume they're lower than they are because perhaps their personalities are, they're slightly rebellious in school. They go, okay, so they're not understanding what's happening in class, so we put them in these remedial classes. But I was just wondering, from your personal experience, do you think this sort of your facility for language and your experimentation with language comes from this sort of living between several languages?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that, just as you said, when you're a language learner, you come off as just far more stupid than you really are. You usually have the personality of a generic nice person. It's very hard to convey your personality. I had that experience again, 8 years ago when I was in Paris, when I was in France trying to learn French, where I was like, oh, I really don't want to be a dumb person again. Like, I already was one when I was 5 and I was trying to learn English. I just want to get to the highest level where you can make mistakes on purpose and not by accident, where people are laughing at you because of something you intentionally said, not because of a mistake you unintentionally made. And I think that because I myself immigrated from Shanghai to New York when I was 5 and had that experience of kind of becoming a baby again at the age of 5, where I couldn't express myself in any way, where I was, by all accounts, an idiot who was unable to form the most basic of sentences. I became very, invested and obsessed with being able to have control over language, over manipulating language. I always really loved repetition and Beckett, and I don't know if this is true, but I assumed when I was reading him, it was because he was like always going between English and French. And when you're learning a language, you repeat a lot. And I love repetition. And so I find myself in my writing repeating a lot. And I don't know if that's because, there is always the stutter of language acquisition and feeling, even now there are certain words where I realize I've never heard them said out loud. I've only read them in a book, or I've only heard my parents say them, and I'll pronounce it wrong. Like when I was 16, I had never been in a car with anyone other than my parents, and so when I went on this trip with my friend who's was a native, white American. We were going under a tunnel, and I was like, oh, look, it's a turnal. And they were like, what? And I was like, turnal, because I'd only heard my mom and my dad say it, and that's how they said it. And, I just had this thought of what if instead of that being humiliating to me, that was something charming and something poetic and something beautiful. So I think I tried to turn a lot of those shames into a site of creation.
Yeah, and I think it shows. I think when you're when you come to a language in that way, that you come with a certain plasticity in the language that sort of is denied perhaps people who are born into it. You kind of see opportunities to twist it in a way that will be denied somebody who's learnt it differently. I think now could be a good moment, since we've been talking about your language, to hear some of it. So maybe you can introduce the extract and read it.
Yeah, I'm going to read from a story called The Empty, The Empty, The Empty. I don't think you need to know that much about it, except that the narrator, her name is Lucy. She is in 4th grade. She just got her first boyfriend, so it's a really big deal for her. And there's been a terrible rumor going around her school that her boyfriend, Jason, this is 4th grade boyfriend, girlfriend, where you become boyfriend and girlfriend just by being hey, you're my boyfriend. They don't actually talk to each other. But there's been some rumor that her so-called boyfriend, Jason, has had his first wet dream. So everyone's like going crazy about that, and this is very disturbing for this girl. Okay. A few days after everyone found out about Jason's wet dream, I went to school and my best friend Francine wasn't there. I missed her and felt dizzy and thought I was going to barf, so I asked Jason to walk me home after school. I'll show you my coin collection, I told him when we were in front of my house, even though the only coins I collected were the chocolate ones that I had to beg my mom to buy at the supermarket. When we got inside the house, I yelled out to whoever was home, "Leave me and my boyfriend alone," and then grabbed Jason and pulled him into my room. "Put it inside me," I said to him, just to test it out. "What?" "Never mind," I said. "I'm not really allowed to have anyone over except Frangie." This is like a family friend whose parents, Frangie's like father is like in a mental institution, and her mom died of cancer, so she's like kind of over Lucy's home all the time. "I'm not really allowed to have anyone over except Frangie. Don't you have to be home?" "Yeah," Jason said, "but you're the one who asked me to come here." We looked at everything in my room except each other. I said, "Say the thing you like best about me again." "Huh? Your favorite thing about me?" I guess that you're my girlfriend." "No," I said, "the other thing." "What other thing?" "If I say it, then it doesn't count." "Everything has to count," Jason said. "Duh." We sat in silence again. "It's kind of the same," I said. "What is? Having a boyfriend and not having a boyfriend?" "Actually, I think it's more bad now." "Rude," he said. "Okay," I said, "can you just beat it, scram, bust out, leave me alone, go away, see you later, alligator, bye-bye, American pies?" You don't make sense and you're bossy," Jason said. "You act dumb and also you're dumb," I said. After he left, I closed the front door behind me and sighed. I suddenly wanted my mom to come home so I could tell her that I had a boy over, even though I knew she was already burdened with so much, and the level of care she could devote to something like this was probably so low in the grand scheme of all the things that she had to care about that it would annoy her more than anything, which wasn't the same thing as caring. And anyway, even though my mom tried to tell me what to do, the fact was she rarely came home before 7 at night, and there wasn't enough time for her to find out what I did while she was away, especially she so often had more work to do once she got home because people sometimes paid her to make their ugly clothes look nicer. She had an old sewing machine that we got from a Salvation Army, and it was mostly good, except sometimes the needle would break into her finger, and then it was days and days of her clutching her swollen, bruised finger, crying that this life was going to kill her. And I would follow her around and blow soft kisses at her finger, which irritated her because my breath was so hot, and the hot air, she said, made everything worse. So it was best to leave her alone, even though that meant I had to be alone, and miss her without letting her know I missed her because it stressed her out to know. Didn't we understand, me and my brother Eddie, that the only reason me and my brother and all the people that we housed in her home weren't already dead was because she and she alone carried all of our burdens on her shoulders? Thanks, I said, sometimes, to let her know that I kind of understood. But that only angered her more, which was how I knew I was useless to her. And that scared me, because it meant I really was related to Frangie, someone who made everything worse, someone who was so helpless that she sucked the energy and life out of the people who had to look after her. And no way was I going to be a Frangie. No way was I going to be a hangers-on in my own home to my own family. No way my mom was ever going to wish that I had never been born the way I wish Frangie had never been born. I vowed to never be my family's charity case. My parents promised me everything was going to change once my father finished business school in the evening and got his degree in business, which wouldn't be long now because my father was a superhuman who broke world records and things that no one kept records for. like the most accelerated course of study in business, while also working 40 plus hours a week delivering Chinese food for this 24-hour place that hired him, because my father was a machine who could ride regular bikes like they were motorbikes, and he made record-breaking time delivering General Tso's chicken to people who lived on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and probably didn't know there was never a General Tso in China. Ha 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 ha, I said when my father told me this, even though I also didn't know it either. In the movies I saw on TV, Chinese delivery guys bought cartons and cartons of fried rice and spring rolls and fried wontons to men who lived in their robes and were surrounded by beautiful women who had the kind of tits you wanted to use as shelves. And in these movies, they always had buck teeth and started every sentence with, "Me likey," or "Me no likey," and had high-pitched voices and stomped around with their arms flailing up and down. And even though I could laugh at anything, I never laughed at that. So things were going to change, but I just had to wait with Frangie and my dumb brother. At her house, Frangie would sometimes talk to herself in the living room. Once she put on my mom's push-up bra and clothes and makeup and asked me to stuff socks in her underwear so that she could have a porn star's ass. "What's a porn star?" I asked. And Frangie only smiled knowingly, so I slapped her on the mouth and said, "That is not a good look on you." And she walked out of the house like that and strutted around downtown with the face of a 10-year-old and the ass and tits of a 20-year-old. She was like the world's most confusing-looking slut. My brother was an even more of a waste than Frangie was. He had gotten a girlfriend not long after I started dating Jason, this girl who already looked like a woman, like she could be someone's mother, and they hung out in his room almost every afternoon. Whenever she was there, he put a flag up on his door. "That is for you to know that you don't disturb me when this," and he pointed to the flag, "is draped across my door. Got it?" "Is this house ever going to be just for us?" I moaned. He ignored me. "What did I just say? Do not ever come in here when this is on my door. Do you understand?" I nodded. "I'm serious, Lucy. Come in and you're fucking dead." I said, "Come into my room and I'll freaking kill you." "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, before shutting the door and staying hours and hours in there with his new girlfriend who had tits the size of Kansas. No, the whole Midwest. No, the entire continent of North America. No, make that the continent of Asia. No, Asia plus Antarctica. No, actually the whole Milky Way galaxy. Her tits were out of this world. Literally. Everyone I knew was living on a different plane from me, and I was the only person left on Earth wandering around dumbly, and it was possible I would have to stay there forever. It wasn't fair I had to be me for as long as I lived, while other people got to be other people. I put my fingers in my vagina, wriggled them all the way in deep until it hurt, and then wiped them on Eddie's door. "Don't worry, Eddie," I said with my mouth pressed up against his door. "Even if you don't come in my room, I'll still freaking kill you." I walked back into my bedroom, locked the door, collapsed onto my carpet, put my fingers back in my vagina, and waited for my mom to get home. Hey.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And that story goes to some quite interesting, some quite dark places towards the end. And I think this is, before I open up questions to the audience, so if you do have a question for Jenny, get it ready and we'll get a microphone to you in a minute. But one thing that really struck me when reading it, I mean, it is an extraordinarily funny book. It's an extraordinarily...
Thank you.
I mean, I don't necessarily use the word daring because, you know, it sort of implies that there are certain things some people should say and certain things that other people shouldn't. But, like, it really occurred to me that it's quite unusual in, and I put this in very sort of heavy scare quotes, in so-called immigrant literature, to find some stories that are so outrageous and so daring in their approach. And is that something you would agree with? That's something you have found? And do you think part of that is to do with the fact that people have been worried in the past they might be sort of representing a community and therefore have to give a sort of a good impression to readers.
Yeah, I think definitely. The burden and responsibility that if there are so few narratives or so few voices who are allowed to be heard, who are allowed to sit at the table or something, then if you are one of those, few, then you better represent your community in a positive way, in a non-threatening way, in a non-vulgar way, in a non-shameful way, in an honorable way. And I think a couple things. One is I also think that there's there's a fetish for immigrant trauma and for and to paint sort of the wretched and the dispossessed as if they were purely good and purely virtuous and purely innocent. And it's people are worthy of our sympathy and our empathy if they are purely good people, but if they misbehave or just be human, then suddenly they're not worthy of it anymore. And so I did want to test that a little of test just how sour things can get. And I think also sometimes I just always ask myself when I write something that might be upsetting to people or might be seen as shocking, I just ask myself will someone be upset because of this fictional thing I've written, or are they just upset to consider that this could happen? I'm not explaining myself very well, but in this story, these two, these kids, they're kids. They're alone all the time because their parents are always working, and they grow up in a really rough and dangerous neighborhood, and they're exposed to all kinds of stuff that they're way too young for. Kids often tend to imitate what they see, even when they're not sort of mentally and psychologically prepared for what that actually is. And I guess I was sort of, I grew up in a neighborhood where the first time I had sex education in my elementary school, every single girl in my class at some point revealed that they had been assaulted or improperly touched by a friend or a relative or a doctor or whatever. And that is disturbing. That shouldn't happen. But what's not disturbing to me, what's disturbing is the covering up of that, the not wanting to acknowledge that, because how will you change that for anyone if you don't even want to feel the discomfort in hearing it? And so that is, to me, disturbing. What's not disturbing is writing about it, reading about it. And so, I try to write these stories without worrying about the responsibility I had and without worrying about how people would react. But then after I wrote them, I went back and I did consider is the harm that this may cause someone, is the discomfort this may cause someone, is it worth it? Is it for something that I believe in the end is more important to write about, if that makes sense? So yeah. I did have that debate, but I tried to wait until the end of writing to have that debate with myself, because I think so often people stop themselves before they even begin. And there is a fine line between exploitation and sort of, opening up a dialogue and communication, and I'm always figuring out where that line is.
And do you think, and maybe this would just be speculation, but do you think the reason we haven't heard stories like this before is because the stories were not necessarily being written, or because perhaps in the industry the stories weren't necessarily making it through to publication? I mean, I've heard several stories in the past of writers of color being told that the stories they've written are not authentic enough by, for example, a white editor. I mean, do you think it's, how much do you think it's that the stories were not being written, and how much do you think it's just they just weren't getting to market?
Yeah, I think there's external and internal censorship, because I've also heard of people of color saying, including myself, it's an emergency out there regarding what we're talking about. Truly, where they're like, I don't want to write this because I don't want to lose the small amount of family I have. I don't want to upset people. Because these are things that are not talked about in my family and my community. I feel that strongly myself. I don't necessarily know what to say about that it can come at great cost. If you are already someone who has very tenuous family in wherever you're living, or already has such few family, the last thing you want to do is alienate them. But also, I think, how many stories have we heard where someone was like, I didn't want to talk about this horrible thing that happened to me because I didn't know what my mom or my parents or my family would think. And I'm not saying that they should have talked about it or not talked about it, but at the very least, when you do talk about it, what does happen is all the people who felt like they should live in shame for the rest of their lives for something that happened to them, maybe they're like, oh wow, maybe I am not, a disgusting, flattened cockroach on the side of the road who should shrivel up under the hot sun and die. Maybe this is actually a common thing that happens, and a lot of people are afraid to talk about it. And I also think, last thing that I will say is that it is very unsettling when something truly heinous happens in the world and we cannot identify right away the villain. And I wrote in this story in particular, I do think it can be hard because it's children hurting children, and it's very hard to say a 9-year-old is evil or is a bad person, and so the question of who is at fault, who bears responsibility, can be very difficult when who is at fault is capitalism, patriarchy, racism. I don't know, that's an institution, that's a structure, it's a thing that's diffuse, that happens almost in the ether sometimes. Or when the person who is at fault are the parents who are not at home, but they're not at home because they're poor. Who is at fault for being poor? I don't know, the chain of fault when it's hard to trace, I think it's very disturbing to people. And so I'm not saying that I'm not saying I'm doing a good job of anything. I'm just saying that I understand that discomfort.
Thank you. I could go on all evening, but I sense there are probably some questions in the audience. If you have a question for Jenny, we have one right there. We'll get a microphone to you so that everybody can hear you. Oh.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Jenny. Thank you for that lovely reading.
Thank you.
I want to respond or follow up on the questions that you dealt with just now in the final section. And I was wondering, because you mentioned, the responsibility of representing, for example, an immigrant community and so on. And I was wondering, when you were writing the book, do you have the problem of, or the struggle of wondering, how much of what I write should be universal enough so that all the audience could, understand it, but also kind of live up to an expectation of you as an immigrant writer? Because the sense that I got, because I'm from Hong Kong and I'm not Asian American, and I write in English as well, and I'm also a journalist, and I've never really gotten anything published that isn't about Hong Kong. And I always get the sense that, if you're a white writer or if you're a white journalist, you can write about just about anything you want and you get an audience for it. But when you're a writer of color, there's always different considerations. And I saw Chen recently also wrote an essay that kind of echoes your essay in BuzzFeed about whether the immigrant tragedy canon, is it something to rebel against, or is it something to partially embrace? So yeah, that's I was just wondering, in terms of narrative, do you embrace it? Do you consider it? And what do you see your audience as?
That's a great question. I think that I have healthy-ish amount of delusion that I work with. I think that's usually helpful for most writers. To be utterly delusional, to be a little bit delusional because, or a little bit like purposefully naive because, yes, there is a fetish for stories about immigrant trauma. There is a fetish for stories for women to tell stories of their assaults and their, the ways in which they've been violated. There's perhaps a fetish for every single type of community to tell a very specific story about themselves. And I think it can be very discouraging when you feel like you're boxed in to, or you're only rewarded for telling one kind of story and you're neglected for telling another. And when I say delusion, I meant that, I decided in response to experiences where I wrote something and was told that I should write something truer to my experience with the assumption that my experience was whatever that person who was telling me this thought it was. And it was usually a very, banal and cliche and trite stereotypical notion of what my experience was, or being told that I wasn't writing authentically. Like, I think one thing I decided in reaction to those kinds of ways of being discouraged is I just decided that, like, I would not. I decided that I could always, if I wanted to, write about, Chinese American characters, and I would permit them every single type of story, just in the ways in which, most of the English canon is comprised of white characters written by mostly white men, and they are permitted to have every type of experience, from war to romance to quiet domestic, minor, squabbles to great, intergenerational, macro, historical, whatever. And I decided that I would write with that same kind of freedom. Now, the question of like whether you will be rewarded in the way that you want to be, that's not guaranteed. And perhaps it's not guaranteed even more for writers of color, but it's also not guaranteed for anyone. And so I think also, but to me, if more people wrote without worrying about where their writing fits in, maybe like you can create your own opportunities, you can create your own communities, you can create your own magazine, you can, you can kind of impose how you'd like the world to be in your vision onto the world a little bit. And that's the part of me that might be a raving delusional maniac. But like, that's what I believe in to keep going. So, yeah.
And just to chip in as a reader who in many ways, in many fundamental ways, my life experience is very different to yours. I think there's sort of, when you read the stories, there is an extraordinary universality to them. And I think like, it was sort of a damn shame if people might say, okay, well, this is written by a Chinese American woman, and therefore
right.
It will have nothing to do with me, because firstly, you limit your experience as a reader, and also you miss out
totally.
On that opportunity to recognize the universality totally. Of experience.
And just really quickly, I don't want to stop the next person, but just, yeah, exactly what you said, just in the way as I'm sure when, when I was growing up, like I loved books like Wuthering Heights, and I just loved books about the freaking English Moors. I don't know why. And, I had no idea what a Moor looked like, didn't even know what accents English people spoke in because I didn't have TV. And yet, like, I was able to make that leap and understand something that was written in 1848 in another country that I'd never been to, never thought I would go to. And I think sometimes, like, it's really silly to underestimate writers. Like, writers can do that for you in the way that you did that for writers. And it would be so insulting to think that, like a white writer can't do that. Maybe they can't, but I think that they can. So I think maybe write for the best possible, smartest reader is also a good way to write. Yeah.
Next question. Who'd like to? Oh, over here. Yeah, you get through. It's fine.
First of all, thank you for your time because actually I have two questions, but I'll ask them at the same time.
Okay.
First, earlier you used immigrant and expat in the same sentence, actually very right after another. So what are your thoughts or personal definition of expat versus immigrant? Because especially with the perspective that white people who move are often referred to as expats, whereas POCs who move are immigrants. The second question, now that Xi Jinping has basically effectively announced that he's going to be president of China forever, what is your thought on the future of the youth of China who already had access to a globalized world, also to the people who are immigrating now, also to the rest of us who are living abroad, witnessing this happening alongside Trump being being a totalitarian, basically.
Right, I know, and Trump thinks Xi Jinping is the most incredible person because I think he wants to be him. But thank you for your questions. I think there's both so many emergencies. There's both. I'll wait for this one to pass. Yeah, I wouldn't conflate. I guess I shouldn't conflate immigrant and expat, and I think people attach a greater amount of freedom to the term expat than they do to the term immigrant. I think people attach sort of a neediness, a despair to an involuntariness almost to immigrating that they don't to, expatriation. I mean, now all of my friends who are quite wealthy and economically mobile and of the artist class are joking about being expats. But I do think because it's so connected to the idea of freedom, the idea of being free to live in the best possible place in the world, that there is no place that is closed off to you, that you can wander and be an adventurer in the best possible place in the world that exists at any given time. I would think that's why it's often associated with whiteness, because whiteness is the racial category that has been afforded the most amount of freedom and that has been given very few limits historically. But, it's like bullshit. And your second question, I think I have a hard time answering that because I only really I feel like I'm not very qualified to say I also confused myself by talking for so long that I did forget part of your question. I will be honest here. But I think I'm not as qualified to answer the second part of your question because I don't know if I can speak about Chinese nationals and people in mainland China. But I do think, I don't know, there is something really interesting and scary happening with China and America being the two great capitalistic and imperial powers right now. Both with absolutely, I will say it, horrible demagogues at the helm who, wish to consolidate all power in their favor. I really have no idea what will happen. It definitely makes it so that the two places I am from are not places I want to live in. But I don't know. I wish for a great, I don't know, for the power of the people to rise and for these people to be, you can guess what that means.
I think we've got time for one more. We'll take this lady just here.
Hi, thank you. My question is about unlikable female narrators, and I heard that you said that you think that people should write how they want, but were there other people telling you maybe you need to make her a little bit more likable in this section, or how did you make your characters so like people wanted to follow them and they liked them enough to keep reading?
Yeah, that's a really great question. How to write unlikable, quote unquote, unlikable characters in a way so that you don't actually alienate everyone from wanting to read them. I don't know how that worked out for me, because I will say that the story that I read from when I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop when I was in my early 20s, and I workshopped that story, and literally I got back the manuscript from this one person who really didn't like the story. She crossed out every single page and wrote the word ugh on every page. And then on the last page she was like, I need to vomit, I hate this, or something like that. And so I didn't win her over. I just did not. And she wasn't the only one. Half the class had the same reaction. And the other half had the other reaction, which was they really liked it. And I do think that specificity, writing in a way that's not necessarily indulgent, but specific without holding back, you will always... There are few people who have the fortune and the great privilege to go through life as an angel. There just are very few. And perhaps... And the ones who think that they are angels are usually the worst monsters. So I do think that most people who are not afraid to acknowledge the little glass shard of monstrosity in them will read something with specificity that you write and not just turn away in disgust and want to vomit, but instead it'll, make them get closer to expelling that shard of monstrosity inside them. So I think just have faith in that. Have faith that it's truly not that bad. I'm sure. I think if you don't, if you can write humanely and with great openness, I think there will always be a reader for that.
Which seems to be a perfect note to end it on. Sour Heart is a really extraordinary collection. I think it's probably come across in the past hour. So extraordinary, in fact, that we have 2 editions of it in stock. We have the British edition and the American edition, so you can choose depending on which cover you prefer. We also have Jenny's poetry collection, which is equally wonderful and a good companion piece to these, and that's not just the bookseller and me talking. So all the books are available at the till. Jenny will be here signing them. Please do stick around, have a glass of wine, continue the conversation, and join me one more time in saying thank you to Jenny Zhang.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. Thanks, everyone.